All right, this is going to be our first lesson in our first unit, Chemistry of Life, and this lesson is all about the properties of water. So, why are we studying water? All life occurs in water, inside and outside the cell. Our planet is 72% water, and that's closely mimicked by the water content of any given cell. While the diversity of life on Earth is great. All living things require water. There's not a living thing out there that we know of that does not. Now, this picture should look really familiar because this should connect back to what we were doing last time, the chemistry of water. We should know water is a very polar molecule, right? We talked about in class how polarity isn't a yes or no thing, it's a spectrum from more non-polar to more polar. Okay. Now, water forms hydrogen bonds with one another, right? We talked about how a hydrogen bond is when the negative part or section of a molecule is attracted to the positive part or section of another polar molecule, like this. Water can form hydrogen bonds with itself. And in fact, one water molecule can form hydrogen bonds with up to a maximum of one, two, three, four other water molecules that are just like in this picture. That's going to be something important to know, right? Now, because of this hydrogen bonding, it creates sticky molecules, right? That means water sticks together because of these hydrogen bonds. And because water is a sticky molecule to itself, it forms these hydrogen bonds and it forms so many of them, one, two, three, four per water molecule. It is going to be responsible, this fact is going to be responsible for all of water's useful properties we talk about today. So, at the very foundation of why water has all these really important properties, think of this picture, think of its very polar nature, think of its ability to form so many different hydrogen bonds with other water molecules, a maximum of four per water molecule. So, water has very special properties, and we're going to talk all about these in more detail. Water has strong cohesive and adhesive properties, which creates its surface tension and capillary action. Again, we'll go through these as we go. This is more just an overview. It's a good solvent. It has a lower density as a solid than a liquid, which is actually very rare among other elements. It has a high specific heat and a high heat of vaporization. So, when we're talking about properties of water that make it important for life, these on this slide, these are what we're talking about. So, these are things that you should remember. And more importantly, as we go through, you should know how water's polarity and ability to form hydrogen bonds gives rise to these different properties and how these different properties make water indispensable for life. So, remember when we said that water forms hydrogen bonds with other water molecules? That makes water cohesive. So cohesion is when one atom or molecule sticks to another atom or molecule of the same type. So one water molecule can form hydrogen bonds and sticks to another water molecule. So that's cohesion, like things stick together. And because water molecules are cohesive or sticky, it creates surface tension. That's why this water strider, this bug in this picture, is able to walk on top of the water because those water molecules under its limbs are sticking together, those hydrogen bonds, and the small weight of this bug isn't enough to break that attraction. Okay. The hydrogen bonds, because water is polar, it's also able to form hydrogen bonds and stick to other polar substances. So, for example, in this graduated cylinder here, you see this kind of U shape. It's called the meniscus because the water on the side next to the glass walls sticks to the glass because the glass molecules are also slightly polar. This is called adhesion, when one substance has a tendency to stick to a different substance. Adhesion. That's also if you take like a shower, you get water beads that stick on the glass door or a glass mirror. That's where water climbs up a paper towel or cloth. You dunk into the water over time from water's cohesive and adhesive abilities. So both of these ideas, properties, cohesion and adhesion, is how water is able to get to the top of very tall trees and fight against gravity. So, for example, there are tube-like structures, vessel elements, xylem and phloem within the trunk of a tree, as an example. And water sticks is able to stick to and climb up the side of those vessel elements through adhesion. And as water climbs up those vessel elements, they all get pulled along one after the other in a long train because water is cohesive. The water molecule below is pulled up by the cohesion it feels with the water molecule above. And that all culminates in the tips of the leaves when water evaporates to the leaf surface. That evaporation pulls on the water below it, creating what we call a column of water. And through those cohesive and adhesive tendencies, it is able to help move water up from the roots even to the tips of the branches of large trees, even like redwoods. Water is also what we call the solvent of life, right? A solvent is a liquid in which solute or particles dissolve in. So water is a good solvent, which means it dissolves a lot of things in it. The polarity of water makes it a good solvent. Usually, polar solvents or polar liquids can dissolve polar stuff or polar particles in it. We could say like dissolves like. Polar solvents dissolve polar solutes or particles inside itself. So polar water molecules are able to surround and form hydrogen bonds with positive and negative ions or solute particles. So, for example, here on this left piece of the picture, this is like a chunk of salt we might have put in water. And you can see how it's broken down into positive sodium atoms and negative chlorine atoms. And the positive hydrogen parts of water molecules surround and are attracted to that negative chlorine ion. And the negative oxygen parts of the water molecules are surrounded and attracted to the positive sodium part. That's what dissolving is. That's what dissolving does. And on the other end, this protein is trying to be dissolved by water molecules. But in general, proteins don't dissolve well in water. They're not polar enough to really dissolve very well in water. That's why shout out to anybody who, you know, is gym rat, has their protein powder, put it in your blender bottle, shake it up, shake it up. Even you can shake it and you can shake it, and a lot of it will dissolve, but you'll always have the crust on the side, and at the bottom you'll get a bunch of powder, and you keep having to shake it because protein isn't super polar in general. And so it has a hard time dissolving in water. So, why do you think it would be important for water to be a good solvent of polar materials to make life possible? Well, the main thing is your blood is mostly water, and ions like chlorine and sodium are needed by many different tissues in your body. And if they were not polar, or if water could not dissolve them, wasn't a good solvent, it would be very hard for them to travel through your blood. Same thing with oxygen and carbon dioxide gas. It would be very hard for them to travel through your blood if they couldn't dissolve in it. Now, fats aren't polar, and that's why it's much more complicated to transport fats and lipids in your body and in your blood. That's why we need like lipoproteins to do that. So, in general, talking about dissolving, we call something that mixes well or dissolves in water something, we call it hydrophilic. Philic means to like, hydro means water, so like it likes water. So polar substances are all hydrophilic. They mix well with water, they dissolve in water, just like these salt uh, ions that you see in this beaker here. On the opposite side, something that does not like water, does not dissolve in water, are non-polar, we call hydrophobic. They don't have an attraction to water. So as we'll learn when we talk about lipids, fats, butter, oils, all of those things are non-polar. They're non-polar. They won't dissolve well in a polar solvent like water, so they're called hydrophobic. Hydro, water, phobic, fear of. They don't mix well with water. What's really interesting is water can only also exist on the planet Earth as a gas, steam, and ice, a solid. Most, if not almost all substances, are more dense when they are solids. That's because when they are solids, the motion of their molecules slows down and they end up being able to come closer together because there's fewer collisions that aren't bouncing off of each other. But this isn't true with water. Ice floats in liquid water. Solid water is less dense than liquid water. That's very rare. Now, the reason is because of all of those, right? Hydrogen bonds water can form with other water molecules. So in liquid water, these water molecules are sliding past one another and they have enough kinetic energy. They're moving quickly enough in the water state that these hydrogen bonds don't stay formed for very long. They form and they break and they form and they break, and these water molecules slide past one another. Now, as the water molecules lose energy, those hydrogen bonds become more stable, more permanent. They don't break as easily because there's less energy in the average atom in that sample of water. Now, because each water molecule is forming four hydrogen bonds with its neighbors, those hydrogen bonds are actually spacing out the water molecules from one another farther away from each other than they would necessarily be if they were liquid and had more energy to continually flow past one another. And that's where we form this crystal lattice crystalline structure of ice when those hydrogen bonds are formed. So if we space them out, that's more space the same number of atoms are taking up. They're less dense and then they float. Now, this is super important for life on Earth. And you can see another picture here of the hydrogen bonds constantly breaking and reforming in water versus remaining stable and spacing the water molecules out in ice. Now, this fact that ice floats is critical for life on Earth because oceans and lakes don't freeze solid. Okay? If ice sank, if ice was more dense than water, eventually all ponds, lakes, and even the oceans would freeze solid. Water would freeze to ice and it would drop to the bottom, and more would freeze solid and drop to the bottom and stack up and stack up and stack up. All right. And in summer, only the few top inches of any body of water would ever thaw. But because ice is less dense, lakes and rivers and bodies of water freeze from the top down. And so the surface layers of ice insulate the water that's below and allow it to maintain a temperature where organisms can still live on the bottom under all of that ice, right? And you might notice in the summer or in the spring and in the fall, the seasonal turning over of water, of lakes, that cycling of nutrients. That's why it usually smells really bad because of the flip of water, the less dense cold water on the bottom rising in the spring and it falling in the winter, the seasonal turnover of lakes, which actually cycles nutrients for the animals living in the lake, which is equally as important. So we get the seasonal turning over of the lake, or in really turbulent conditions does the same thing to mix those nutrients. Water also has a high specific heat. What that means is water can absorb a lot of energy before its temperature changes. So it takes a lot of thermal energy to be put into water for its temperature to change. So it resists changes in its temperature. It can take up a lot of heat before it heats up, and it takes a long time for it to cool down. Now, this is super important because that allows the Earth's temperature to be moderated by the oceans. The oceans can absorb a lot of thermal energy, and it won't cause the atmospheric temperature to change drastically because water is able to absorb a lot of that energy, and it's the water's ocean temperature doesn't change drastically. All right. And again, that specific heat is due to all of those hydrogen bonds because it takes a lot of energy to weaken and to break all of those hydrogen bonds. And and it's them breaking and the average velocity of each of those molecules of water increasing, which causes the temperature to rise, right? Temperature in general in the kinetic molecular theory is just a measure of the average kinetic energy of the particle. So here's a specific map of kind of the North and Central Americas. And you can think about how the climate difference is on the coasts here versus inland, and the effect that water has in moderating those temperatures, right? Doesn't get super cold, right? Right on the coast here doesn't get, because water is able to moderate. Water also has a high heat of vaporization. That means it takes a lot of energy to go from a liquid to a gas. So you might have remembered seeing one of these curves from chemistry, and on the y-axis is temperature, and on the x-axis is energy. So here, this blue part is liquid water, and this blue part here by F is water vapor. And this purple line that's going across here, this is the transition. This is the transition state from water boiling and turning all into gas. Now, look at all of the energy that's required to turn liquid water into gas. It's a lot of energy to break all of those hydrogen bonds such that water can overcome its vapor pressure and go into the atmosphere. So it takes a lot of energy to turn liquid water into gas. And that's why sweating is so important. That's why it is so useful in maintaining our core temperature, because when we're out and it's a sunny day or we're working hard and we start sweating, those sweat droplets, that water is able to absorb a bunch of heat energy from our bodies before it evaporates and carries that energy away. So it works really well at removing heat from our body because it takes a lot of energy to turn it into gas. And that energy that it absorbs is then radiated away from our bodies or removed from our bodies, and we're able to maintain a cool body temperature. Water as a substance ionizes. All that means is that water can be split into positive ions and negative ions. We can split a positive hydrogen ion off from water and have a negative hydroxide ion like this, right? Now, pH in general is based on water. pH is a measure of how acidic or basic something is. And if something is acidic, what it means is that when we put that substance in water, that substance will increase the concentration of positive hydrogen ions in the water. And if something is basic, it will increase the concentration of negative OH ions in that water. Another way to think about it is something that's acidic will donate positive hydrogen ions into the water, and something that's basic will remove positive hydrogen ions from the water. Pure water is right in the middle. It is neutral. Pure water is a 7 on the pH scale of 1 to 14. Things that are closer to 1 are acidic. Things that are closer to 14 are basic. So something that contributes a lot of hydrogen ions into solution would have a low pH, and something that removes a lot of hydrogen ions away from the solution would be close to 14. Water can also ionize into hydrogen ion and an OH ion. That's why it's neutral, is because it dissolving or dissociating in water maintains a hydrogen OH balance. Neutral. Okay. So in pure water, we have a 7 on the OH scale. In fact, only one water molecule in every 554 million breaks apart into H and OH. It's a very small amount of ions. Right? So water is neutral because it does not hardly at all increase the hydrogen ion or the hydroxide ion concentration when it's in water. Why is the fact that water is neutral and pH important in biology? Because most biological fluids like blood and plasma, things like that, have a pH between 6 and 8. Okay. Now, each pH unit represents a 10-fold difference in, in hydrogen ion concentration. So something that has a pH of 8 is 10 times more basic or 10 times less acidic than something with a pH of 7. And it's 100 times more basic or 100 times less acidic than something with a pH of 6. Now, the truth of the matter is our bodies, to maintain homeostasis, can only withstand very small changes in actual pHs. So, for example, your blood pH is about 7.35. Okay. Now, if it gets to like 7.8, that's lethal. Or if it gets down to below 7, not going to work out either. So pH in living systems is very important because most living systems have a very small tolerance of pH. And that's why water is so perfect to be the main solvent of living things, because its pH of 7 is usually right in the middle of that sweet spot for homeostasis of different organisms. Now, here's the pH scale and some different common items that would be roughly different pHs from 0 to 14. As we were talking about, the pH of cells must be kept at 7.35, let's just say 7, because pH, as we'll learn, affects the shape of a molecule, and the shape of a molecule affects its function. So the pH can affect cellular functions. In your bodies, pH is controlled or balanced by things that are called buffers. And buffers are substances that balance out pH, that are able to donate hydrogen ions when the hydrogen ion concentration of the solution they're in falls, or they absorb hydrogen ions when the hydrogen concentration rises beyond a certain point. So they're kind of situationally both acidic and basic. Donate hydrogen ions when too many are being removed from solution, and absorbing them when too many are being added to solution. So help maintaining a constant pH as hydrogen ions are added or removed. So to wrap it all up, what's the punchline? Water is a polar molecule. The fact that it's polar gives rise to all of its special properties which make life on Earth possible, and that the chemical behavior of water governs how organisms are able to function.